By the end of 1941, the Soviet Union had lost nearly 9 out of every 10 tank crewmen it fielded. That number is staggering when you consider what the Red Army began the war with. On June 22, 1941, the morning of Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union had the largest tank force in the world. Over 24,000 machines stood on its books, more than the rest of the world combined. On paper, it looked invincible. And yet within 6 months, that colossal armoured force was shattered. Entire units ceased to exist. Thousands of tanks lay burned out on the steppes. Their crews either killed in action, captured, or buried alive inside the machines that were supposed to protect them. So how did the world's biggest armoured fleet collapse so quickly? To answer that, we need to look at what kind of tanks the Soviets had, how they were manned, and why being a tanker in 1941 was one of the deadliest jobs in the world. In the late 1930s, the Soviet Union invested heavily in armoured warfare. Soviet designers, inspired by deep battle theory, built tanks in staggering numbers. Light tanks like the T-26 and the BT series were churned out by the thousands. They were fast, simple, and relatively cheap. For a while this made sense. These were tanks designed to exploit breakthroughs, not fight other tanks head-on. But by 1941, the world had changed. Germany had unleashed blitzkrieg in Poland and France, proving that armoured divisions could smash entire armies if used decisively. Soviet leadership watched with alarm. Yet Stalin refused to believe Hitler would turn that same lightning war against the USSR anytime soon. Compounding this was the Great Purge of the officer corps. Thousands of experienced commanders, including some of the pioneers of Soviet armoured theory, were imprisoned or executed. The Red Army that faced the Wehrmacht in June 1941 was bloated on paper, but hollow in training, leadership, and organisation. The 24,000 tanks the USSR fielded were not the unstoppable juggernauts people often imagine. In fact, the majority of those machines were already obsolete by the time the Germans crossed the border. The most common type was the T-26, a small infantry support tank armed with a 45mm gun and thin armour. It was perfectly adequate in the Spanish Civil War, where it fought Italian and German light tanks, but by 1941, against Panzer III and Panzer IV models supported by 37mm and 50mm guns, the T-26 was little more than a rolling coffin. A single hit could set it ablaze. The BT-7 and its relatives, the quote fast tanks, were another large chunk of the fleet. Inspired by American Christie designs, they could race across open terrain at impressive speeds. But speed was their only strength. Their armour was paper thin, and their engines burned through fuel at alarming rates. In the reality of the Eastern Front, they died almost as quickly as they were committed. And then there were the new designs, the T-34 medium tank and the KV-1 heavy. These were the machines that shocked German commanders. The T-34, with its sloped 45mm armour and powerful 76.2mm gun, could shrug off hits that would destroy a panzer. The KV-1 was even more terrifying, virtually impervious to German anti-tank weapons in 1941. But here is the catch. Out of those 24,000 tanks, only about 1,800 were T-34s and KV-1s. Most of the Red Army went to war in machines already outdated, and even the new tanks were crippled by another problem: the men inside them. A tank is only as good as the crew that operates it, and in 1941, Soviet tankers often had little more than a few weeks of rushed training. Some had not even fired their main gun before rolling into battle. Others had barely learned how to maintain the complex machines they were entrusted with. There simply were not enough qualified instructors. The purges had gutted the experienced officer corps, and the sudden expansion of armoured forces meant raw recruits were being rushed into service at an unsustainable pace. Communication was another disaster, as only a fraction of Soviet tanks had radios. Most commanders had to rely on signal flags in the middle of a battlefield, where seconds meant life or death. Compare that to German panzers, where radios were standard, and you start to see the deadly gap. This lack of preparation meant that even the mighty T-34s and KV-1s were often squandered. Crews did not know how to coordinate. Units attacked piecemeal, stumbling into ambushes. Powerful tanks were abandoned because no one had taught the crew how to perform basic field repairs. On paper, Soviet tanks in 1941 covered the full spectrum. Light, fast BTs for exploitation, T-26s for infantry support, medium and heavy machines that, in theory, could crush anything the Germans had. But technical specifications do not win wars, doctrine, training and logistics do. German panzer divisions were smaller in raw numbers, but honed to a razor's edge. Every vehicle had a radio. Crews were experienced, having fought campaigns in Poland, France and the Balkans. They trained together, maneuvered as units, and executed combined arms warfare with deadly precision. By contrast, Soviet armour was thrown into massive counterattacks with little coordination. At battles like Brody-Dubno in June 1941, one of the largest tank clashes in history, nearly 3,000 Soviet tanks faced fewer than 1,000 German panzers. On paper, the Soviets had the advantage. In reality, poor communication, lack of fuel, and chaotic leadership meant the Germans destroyed the bulk of Soviet armour while losing only a fraction of their own. By December 1941, the Soviet Union had lost more tanks than the rest of the world even possessed. Thousands were destroyed in combat. Thousands more were abandoned because they ran out of fuel or broke down without spare parts. And inside those burned-out hulls were the bodies of Soviet tankers who never had a chance. By the winter of 1941, the Red Army's tank arm was a graveyard. Burned-out hulls littered the fields of Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. German troops nicknamed some areas, quote, tank cemeteries, because the wrecks stretched as far as the eye could see. For Soviet tank crews, the average life expectancy was not measured in weeks or even days. Sometimes it was measured in hours. So why did survival rates collapse so quickly? The answer lies in a brutal mix of poor preparation, flawed doctrine, and the raw realities of facing the Wehrmacht at its peak. The first and most obvious reason was how Soviet armour was committed. Instead of concentrated punches, tank units were flung into the fight piecemeal. Divisions and brigades attacked without proper reconnaissance, often charging headlong into German ambushes. At Brody-Dubno in June 1941, nearly 3,000 Soviet tanks went forward in waves. On paper, they should have steamrolled the 1,000 German panzers opposing them. Instead, coordination collapsed. Units arrived on the battlefield at different times, without fuel or ammunition resupply. Some tanks never even reached the front because they broke down on the march. The result, the Soviets lost about 2,500 tanks in just a few days. That kind of disaster was not the exception, it was the rule, because if you climbed inside a Soviet tank in 1941, you were almost guaranteed to be inexperienced. Training programs were rushed. Many drivers had never handled heavy machinery before the army drafted them. Gunners often had not practiced with live ammunition. Commanders had little idea how to coordinate multiple vehicles, let alone combined arms with infantry and artillery. The lack of radios made things worse. Most Soviet tanks relied on hand signals or coloured flags. In the dust, smoke and chaos of battle, that was practically useless. Crews could not warn each other of threats, could not manoeuvre as a unit, and could not adapt when things went wrong. German tankers, by contrast, could talk to each other in real time, giving them an enormous tactical edge. And then there was the issue of maintenance. Soviet factories produced thousands of tanks, but not enough spare parts. Crews often did not know how to repair their vehicles. A jammed gearbox or broken track could mean abandoning a perfectly good machine, and in the heat of retreat, crews rarely had time to set demolition charges. Many Soviet tanks fell into German hands intact, and when tanks did make it into battle, the odds were still stacked against their crews. A hit from a German 50mm or 75mm gun often set Soviet tanks ablaze. Gasoline engines in the BT and T-26 were highly flammable. Ammunition storage was unprotected. Crews had little chance to escape once fire spread inside the turret. Survivors of these incidents often recalled comrades burning alive, trapped by jammed hatches. Even the more advanced T-34 and KV-1 were not immune. Yes, their armour could shrug off German shells early in the war, but without proper tactics or support, these tanks often ended up surrounded, immobilised and destroyed at close range by artillery, engineers with explosives or dive-bombing Stukas. For tankers, survival was a coin toss. Either your machine was knocked out and you never got out, or you bailed out into a battlefield swarming with German infantry. Captivity was its own nightmare. By the end of 1941, millions of Soviet prisoners of war were dead from starvation, disease and executions. Another factor that sealed the fate of Soviet tank crews was Stalin's own directives. In the opening weeks of Barbarossa, retreat was considered treason. Crews were ordered to stand and fight, even when the situation was hopeless. This meant throwing wave after wave of undertrained men into impossible attacks. At times, Soviet commanders would commit their last armoured reserves in desperate counterstrikes, knowing full well they were sending their men to slaughter. For the tankers, it was a nightmare cycle. They were either destroyed in combat, abandoned their tanks because of mechanical failure, or found themselves ordered into suicidal assaults. Few made it out alive, and by the end of 1941, the Soviet Union had lost about 20,000 tanks, nearly its entire pre-war stock. That is more than all German tanks produced during the entire war. Alongside those machines, tens of thousands of Soviet tankers perished. Estimates suggest survival rates were so low that in some units, replacements cycled in and died within the same week. That is why historians argue that nearly 90% of Soviet tank crews who went into battle in 1941 never came back. And yet, as grim as this story is, it is not the end. The catastrophe of 1941 forced the Red Army to adapt. Survivors of those early tank battles became hardened veterans. Training standards slowly improved. Radios began to appear in more tanks. Commanders learned from their mistakes, reorganizing armored units into a more effective structure. Most importantly, Soviet industry relocated east of the Urals, safe from German bombs, and began producing T-34s in unprecedented numbers. By 1942 and 1943, the Red Army was not just replacing its losses, it was outproducing Germany by staggering margins. But the men who died in 1941 paid for that future with their lives. Their sacrifice bought the Soviet Union time to reorganize, time to save Moscow, and ultimately time to turn the tide. So when we hear that 90% of Soviet tankers died in 1941, it is not just a statistic. It is a reminder of what happens when an army is unprepared for the war it faces. When training, leadership, and doctrine fail, even the best machines in the world can become steel coffins. The Red Army eventually turned its armored corps into the spearhead of victory, but the price was almost unimaginably high. So, what do you think? Were those losses inevitable against the Wehrmacht of 1941, or could better preparation have saved Soviet crews from such devastation? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown insightful, do not forget to like, subscribe, and check out our other videos about the men and machines of World War II.